I'd like to call the meeting of September 30th, 2008 of the City of Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee to order. Ms. Weiss.
Thank you, Chair Williams and members of the committee. Beatrice Ramirez will walk through a PowerPoint presentation we have for today. We do have extra copies of the PowerPoint and a new table that is essentially, she's broken the table down into the various PowerPoint slides. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Goularte for the introduction and presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the Ordinance Committee. As Betty said, this was continued from last week. As you know, we came to you to start the discussions of some possible provisions that could be included in an interim ordinance if it's decided to go forward with one. Through the discussion, it was asked that it would be a good idea to come back and further discuss and compare the April, I'm calling it the April interim ordinance, with the draft interim provisions that we were proposing, and to come back and focus on those issues of open space, setbacks, the FARs, the height, and you did not include unit size as an issue to come back and discuss, but we would like to consider still on the table the option of considering reducing unit sizes as part of an interim, if there's time today. The height issue we know is a very important issue and one that's of great importance to the community along with with all of them. We do believe that open space setbacks and the FARs are good ordinance discussion type issues to get into here at the Ordinance Committee. And while we'll go over the comparison of the two height recommendations, we're suggesting that the height really does warrant the full discussion and therefore may be more appropriate at the October 8th meeting where you'll have the full council as well as the benefit of the Planning Commission there. But we will, when we go into the table and the comparisons, we will touch on all of these things. Okay, we think it's important to understand, and we did touch on these last week, but we want to more slowly go into our existing standards for open space, as well as what was proposed in the April interim and what we're recommending in Plan Santa Barbara. Currently, in a commercial zone that allows residential zoning, if you are developing a residential project or a mixed-use project, we currently have as a requirement that you provide 10% open space on grade. So already your mixed-use projects in your C2, CM, or any of your commercial zones, you are required to provide open space. And one thing that was recently added that you recently adopted was this additional 15 by 15 foot common area that is flexible where it be placed, whether it be on grade. And if it's on grade, it could take up part of your 10%. But if it's not on grade, then you would have to have a full 10% on grade. Or you could provide your open space for a residential or mixed-use project with a different method. There's two methods. And the second method is that you just have a total 15% of your lot area as common open space. Currently in the ordinance, there's no flexibility as it has to be on grade. So in the April interim, they are proposing, the preparers, they didn't really specify residential, so it wasn't clear to us if the existing residential standards were carried forward. We're not clear there. But they did specify that for commercial, it would be 5% of the total net lot area. In our existing standards, commercial does not have an open space requirement. But most of the commercial zones, with the exception of C2 and CM, have a 10 to 20 foot front yard setback. Now in the April interim, they're also proposing that any mixed use project have a 10% of net lot area. Again, we don't understand, we weren't clear if this is in addition to what the existing regulations require, because the April interim was proposing that 10% be open and adjacent to the public street, so that it be like the frontage. And irrespective of what it's called, it seemed to appear more like a front yard setback versus what we call a front yard versus open space. That ordinance recommended exempting those parcels fronting on State Street from Cabrillo to Sola and 1 block east and west. In the Plan Santa Barbara interim, we were not recommending any change to residential because we have existing, 2 methods to provide open space on a site. As far as commercial, we weren't proposing any change given that everything but C2 and CM have a 10 to 20 foot front yard setback already. But we were recommending a 5-foot variable setback along the frontage so that you would have some open space along the front of a building, but not an open space, a front yard setback. In the mixed use, we weren't proposing any change necessarily because, again, we already have existing regulations, and I'll show a slide in a minute that kind of shows existing regulations. But we were proposing that we consider if someone does method B, where you just do 15% of the lot area as open space, that it be flexible as to where some of that is located so that some of it could provide open space for the tenants to live on the upper floors. I want to get a little into setbacks, and again, we're going to focus more on the...
Yes. Hold off there. To keep it simple,
Okay.
I was going to offer committee members the option of asking questions subject by subject. If you...
Sure. Let me just get to the slide that could help.
Right.
Can I go over just the 3 examples?
Sure.
This is an example, and this includes the setback and the open space because it kind of goes hand in hand. This is an example showing where you have the recommended 5-foot front yard. It's not to scale again. And you have a 10% open space, which is your green area. You'd have your 15-foot by 15-foot common. This is using the method number 1, for open space, where you have private outdoor living spaces for each of the 3 units. This is a mixed-use building. Then you have your 10% open space, your 5-foot setback, as well as some form of common open yard. This open yard could be, in this example, it's as a roof deck.
Mm-hmm. On that diagram, the only new thing that you see up there is the 5-foot front yard setback. Yes, which we have another diagram to show you how that could be an average. In this case, they're just meeting it, meeting it all the way across. And how that diagram, if you go back, B, compares to the April idea. Again, the April idea said you had to have 10% open space. Well, that is already in the ordinance, the 10% open space. The new twist on the April idea was that there was some language about it occurring along the street frontage. And so we think that the 10% open space would remain an existing standard that should continue to apply to mixed-use buildings. And we're introducing the 5-foot front yard setback as variable as something you might want to consider for all C2 and CM zone property, whether or not it's residential, mixed use, well, not residential, excuse me, whether or not it's mixed use or commercial. Okay, and then back to your chart, B.
So here's another example.
If I may just, you said all except, I thought it was for all commercial except C2 and CM because they have already 10 to 20 foot front yard setback requirements.
No, it would be apply to the new 5-foot variable setback would apply to C2 and CM because all the other commercial zones, not M1, we're not talking about M1, but C1, the SD2 ordinance, the CP zone, those all have front yard setbacks already. The only commercial zones that don't have front yard setbacks are the C2 and CM, which happen to be the commercial zones that allow 60 feet in height.
I had it backwards. I understand now. The
Okay.
C2 and CM are the zones that do not have a front yard setback requirement, and this 5-foot average would apply to that.
As a new standard, yes.
Thank you.
So we just have a couple of other examples. This example shows the 5-foot variable setback. The way we understand it is you have to show whatever you have encroaching into that 5 feet, you have to show below it. So if you have a 5 by 20 area here that goes up to the property line, then you'd have to show a 5 by 20 behind it. So this is showing the 5-foot variable as well as the 10% open space, your private outdoor living space, and your 15 by 15 as a roof deck. Again, the new standard is just the 5 foot on this slide. Here's another example, and this is using the method B of providing your open space, where you're providing a 15% common open space. You do have to have a minimum 20 by 20 area, so that could be, for example, on a roof deck. And then all around, you have to meet your 15%. And this is with a variable 5 foot. Again, the only new thing on this slide is the 5 foot variable setback. I think, yeah, that's the only examples. Any more questions on open space?
Any questions from the committee members? Let's go on the setbacks.
Okay. As far as setbacks, currently, any residential use on a commercial site, you have a 10-foot to 20-foot front yard setback. And then you have an interior yard setback of 6 to 10 feet, or 10 feet or half the building height when you're next to a residential zone. If you're proposing a commercial and mixed-use building, you have a front yard setback of 10, as we already discussed, of 10 to 20 feet, except for in the C2 and CM zone where there is none. And there's also no interior yard setbacks for commercial or mixed use, except for RO and CO. Those do have interior yards, unless you're next to a residential zone. If you're next to a residential zone, you have a setback of 10 feet or half the building height. The April interim was recommended that basically, as far as setbacks, that the third and fourth stories be set back an average of 5 feet from the property line facing a public street. In what we were proposing in this Plan Santa Barbara interim was the 5 foot average setback along the building frontage, with exception of those buildings fronting on State. I think we said from Montecito, because that's where C2 starts, to Victoria, and 1 block east and west. Any questions as far as setbacks?
Any questions from the committee members? Maybe I'll just summarize if you see it this way. So essentially, on open space requirements, the interim ordinance in April was essentially status quo with existing code, and you but it would be stronger on commercial only buildings. And then the setback requirements, the April 08 was perhaps stronger than existing code, but you're suggesting something, this 5 foot variable setback that would be stronger yet and perhaps a little bit more easier to work with.
I would say yes, in that the idea that in April there would be a setback for the third and fourth stories. When we get to the floor area percentages, what I understood, and having spoken with particularly Brian Cornell, because he had been involved in that interim idea in April, I think the feeling is that the floor area ratios without a specific identified setback might be more flexibility for architects to design to different architectural styles. And that issue came up in your hearing last week as well. So that's why a specified setback for those upper stories wasn't recommended by staff at this time. We were recommending your more traditional front yard. The building is set back 5 feet or variable 5. And then you'll see when we talk about the floor area ratios, which is very similar to the April, that's where you get into how the third or fourth story is reduced, and then therefore there's space around it. Whether or not it's front, side, back, the space could come. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Does that one next.
Mr. House?
So on the setbacks, let's see if I get this. There's no changes that would be in the suggested interim ordinance except for the 5 foot average setback along the building frontage in the C2 and CM, because the other commercial zones have front yard setbacks already established. And in a commercial zone, commercial buildings can be built right to the property line, which for a mixed-use building, for instance, could be problematic if there were a required setback there. That becomes a little dead zone. It could be kind of dangerous, in fact. And so the idea is that where you have mixed use with commercial on the ground floor, you could actually build a building as you would a commercial building right to the property line next to an adjacent commercial building. So there's no side yard requirements there. Okay. And then except in the RO and CO zones, which already have existing 6 to 10 feet requirements, and in the 100% residential and commercial and mixed use, all of them have a accommodation if they're near a residential zone, which sometimes happens, which would be behind perhaps or adjacent to, and there they have to have a setback that's half the height of the building to give some sort of a consideration for the residential that would be nearby.
Correct.
Can't believe I'm understanding this. Thank you very much. All right, thanks.
Continue.
Okay, we've already covered these. So floor area ratio. Currently, we don't have any floor area ratios, as you all know. In the April interim, they were recommending that a first and second story be taken up by no more than 80% as far as residential use. So it wasn't clear. We're assuming that they could build at 100%, but 80%, no greater than 80% could be residential. The third,
I wanted to comment on that. That was, again, something I followed up on, was mixing a use standard into a design setback. And so we just put that aside. And we could talk about that as a separate issue.
I think the intent was similar to what you put down, the assumption being that the ground floor is commercial. But not always, so.
Okay.
okay. And the recommendation for third story was that 60% of the net lot area, and the fourth story would be 45% of the net lot area. In the plan in Santa Barbara, we were recommending in the C2 and CM again, because that's where 60 feet is currently allowed, and there are no setbacks, is that the first and second story could build out at 100% of the net lot area. The third story, we had, again, because we were just beginning discussions if we should even consider these provisions, we had a range of 60 to 70% of the net lot area, with the fourth story being 40%. So very similar as far as the ratios. And again, we haven't had any kind of design charrettes. Don't really know how this would all play out as far as building sizes. This is a graphic that just kind of a visual representation of a 40, 60, 90 to 100%. We said 90 to 100 because if we adopt any kind of setbacks, you couldn't use that as building area. So you could, in essence, end up with pretty large step backs of 10 and 30 feet on your third story with, for example, 20 and 50 feet on your fourth story with these type of ratios. Again, where those are placed could differ. Someone could choose to put them closer to one side than the other. But just for purposes of discussion, this is a representation of the 40, 60, 90 to 100. Any questions?
House.
When you say 100%, that would be that would be 100%, but there would be a 5-foot average setback, so it would be 100% after you took out the 5-foot average setback, right?
Correct.
And in the CM and C2 zones.
Yes.
Yes, and there could be surface parking. The point was that the first and second floors would be able to be equal coverage in the event that you, let's say you were building just a 2-story building, mm-hmm. and you wanted to have a simple 2-story building with essentially the walls going straight up, that would allow for that. And again, that's based on testimony that we've had from architects that you see many buildings like that in Santa Barbara, and that for the first and second floors it would be important to have the same coverage allowance.
Well, okay, I thought that we had, maybe I'm mistaken, when for a second or a third floor now, do we have varying requirements for setback from the property line or anything like that in the commercial? I mean, I I know that very many times we have projects that come and the first or second story is this far, and then the third story is set back a little bit further. And I thought we had requirements that had them do that.
I think, again, in the C2 and CM, where there are no setback requirements, it's not the zoning that results in that variation in building. I think you often see buildings that have that for a number of reasons, say exterior stairways, the location of windows, neighboring property conditions. So
All sorts of design reasons.
right, there are many reasons
But
why
we don't have a requirement that sets the third floor back an extra 5 feet or something in any of these zones?
not in the C2 and CM.
What about the other commercial zones?
Again, I think in the CP zone, which exists up along the Upper State Street area, and you have the SD2 overlay,
Right.
there is a front yard setback. And there's also standards about the size of your third story not being greater than a percentage of your lower stories. So you do see that in the Upper State Street area. As Ms. Gularte mentioned, certainly in the RO and CO, where you even have interior yard requirements, you do see that.
Okay, and those are often mixed in with residential neighborhoods where they are, right? The one in St. Francis area that was that's a medical. That's CM, yeah, that's right.
CO does have the setback.
And CO has a setback requirement too. Okay, well, thank you.
One other question. Have you made the chart available to folks in the audience? Okay.
Now, as far as building height, currently our definition of building height is measured from the maximum vertical height of a building measured at all points from natural or finished grade, whichever is lower. Architectural elements that do not add floor area to a building, such as chimneys, vents, antenna, and towers that do not have floor area, are not considered in the height, but all the portions of the roof are included. Now, we were concerned with the April interim proposed definition because it was the height measured from adjacent natural grade to the top of the uppermost horizontal plate height of habitable space. So basically exempting all the roof structure. So they were also proposing that towers, irrespective, I guess, if they have floor area or not, stairwells, elevator shafts shall be considered architectural projections and shall not be included in the height. We were not recommending any change to the definition of building height as part of any interim. As far as the standards in a comparison, currently the C2 and CM allow 4 stories up to 60 feet. All other zones allow 45. Again, there's lower heights required if you're next to residential zones, and some of our C2 is limited to 45 feet because of the SD2 overlay, so all of Upper State. The April interim was recommending that 40 feet be the new standard for all commercial zones that allow residential. But they were adding an additional 12 feet if at least 30% of the units were affordable to 200% or less of the area median income. In the planned Santa Barbara interim, we originally were just proposing for discussion that we keep the 60 feet, but study a buffer where we would further reduce the building heights when you're next to a listed historic resource or to a residential zone. Another item, again, as it came up in the last meeting, is looking at options for building height, which will be further discussed at the next meeting. But another possible consideration for discussion could be a 45-foot allowance with up to 60 feet for those council-designated community priority or projects with higher affordability of units. And again, those would need to be defined by council. And I just want to make a point here. There's some confusion as to, as you know, in the Plan Santa Barbara policies, we talk about allocating square footage only to community benefit land uses. And it's a pretty broad list of types of things that could be community benefits. What we're considering here is community priority. Community priority are those projects which you're very familiar with. They're the ones that you have to make a preliminary finding that it meets a community priority need, and then it has to come back. It's like the hospital, the C center, child cares, waterfront, types of things that meet a community need. Again, these are just provisions that could be further, that should be further discussed. Any questions on building height?
Any questions? Yes. Mr. House.
One of the things, I know there's a lot to this conversation, but it would be very interesting to have examples of buildings that are already constructed, images of them with their heights identified, to be able to get some ideas to what practically these numbers mean. It's very hard to imagine what 45 feet is, or 52 or 60 in real terms. I know we have a couple of buildings that have been built in the city of Santa Barbara that exceed 60 feet, maybe 3 or 4 possibly, if you count the hospital, but there's very few. And then if we're going to continue with this discussion, I think that would be very important to help people get some perspective.
Good idea.
And please, if you have a public comment, please turn in your slips. Oh, we have several? Do we have any more questions?
I do. I wanted to ask a little more about this. Where you're measuring this to? We're in our currently the way we measure is to the ridge of a roof, except for architectural elements like chimneys and stuff. And we've seen towers that are kind of hollow inside. They don't really add a floor. They just are architectural features. So those have been allowed.
Correct.
But in what's suggested here, that wouldn't change. That way, there's no chance that somebody would measure to an eave line and then have a very steep pitched roof that would just really be super tall and maybe go really high, right? I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah, I wanted to explain the history of the definition of building height. It was amended in 1992 specifically to deal with that issue, because the building height definition in the zoning ordinance for many years was 8 feet above the last or highest finished floor. And so it did not account for any of the roof structure. And that was a concern throughout the community, but in particular in residential neighborhoods. It was the same way of measuring in everywhere, and there was concern in hillside areas and residential neighborhoods. And I participated in that update process, and my understanding from the design community, the review boards, and the council at the time, that having this new, it's not so new now, but the current definition was the height of the building. And so I was a little surprised to see discussion of changing the way the height of the building was measured. I think that last item in the April discussions was somewhat of an effort to deal with that a parapet, which is part of the roof structure, if you did that type of structure, would be limited to 40 feet along the front property line. Again, concern about the rise of the building right in the front at the sidewalk. But our hope is that we would continue using the existing definition, which has been used now for many, many projects throughout the community since 1992.
So in that same vein, if I may, you know how they hide the air conditioning units and all that stuff up there on the roof behind the, what are they called, mansard
roof or parapet, yes.
The top edge of the mansard roof would be where we'd measure to in that case, right? In other words, it wouldn't be in the current case,
Mm-hmm.
or in any case if we're going to use the same definition.
Of the current definition, yes.
Okay. So they'd have to hide it, and then that would go down, and then you'd have the upper floor and habitable space, something like
yes.
that. Okay. Thank you.
I think I can also just answer the intent. The intent is that to incentivize red tile roofs, that a restrictive height change, such as 40 feet, without changing the definition, would give a tremendous incentive not to have a sloped red tile roof, because the whole height of that roof would be counted in the height of the building. And therefore, if you have 38 feet of habitable space, you don't have much room for a roof. So the intent is to not see a situation in the future where we saw much fewer red tile, roofs downtown because of the height limitation.
With the revised definition that was in the April 08 suggested interim. Okay.
Right.
And I do want to note that the last chart we had last time, we provided just a little bit of information regarding the initiative, what that language is. I'm sorry, I don't know if we have it for you today. Do we have any language? The charter language recommended, no, the charter. The petition drive still acknowledges that the city council may define building height. That's what the charter says now as well, definition of building height to be made by the city council. Oh, how it's measured, not definition. I think maybe I don't have the language in front of me. Ms. Lodge is saying the wording may be how the building height is measured.
Maybe you could clarify that a little bit later on. Any other questions before we take public comment? And
We just saved unit size.
Yeah, go ahead and go
Okay.
into.
I wanted to make a pitch for unit size because
Persistent. We respect
it just
that.
went away so quickly last time. I was surprised. We had a meeting with the Planning Commission last week, and I made a distinction between what staff was putting for your consideration, the council, the community to consider as an interim change versus what's being looked at in Plan Santa Barbara. In Plan Santa Barbara, we're looking at unit size as how that may be a different way to determine allowed densities as well as location and type of unit. And so when the council sees the Plan Santa Barbara package of policies, you will see that there are a number that look at considering density tied to unit size in a variety of ways, as well as incentives for affordable housing and then the location within a transit area. So Plan Santa Barbara, as it should, is looking at it in a more complex and comprehensive way. The thought behind including unit size here is, I think, because the maker of the motion at the council meeting, too, included unit size as something that we should all look at in a possible interim ordinance. And I think the body that is requested it most has been the Planning Commission. As we explained, they have taken the initiative to send clear messages to the staff and applicants that we don't want to see large one-bedroom units taking up all the space that the units take up. So I think unit size definitely relates to building size and building design. And Mr. Limon did a study in this intervening week looking at other projects that have gone through the review process with these new standards. And a unit size reduction along with increased setbacks, open space, and such, would really be compatible towards the goal of reducing the size and mass of buildings, if that's one of the outcomes that you're looking for in this project, or this, considering this ordinance. So without the unit size reduction, you could still certainly have very large buildings. And so we put out a chart with this range to consider. I'm trying to think of how does this hurt someone or a project? What does this do that is a bad thing now in an interim when you know that Plan Santa Barbara is looking at it very what's wrong with having the council say for the next several years we have a new standard and it relates to unit size when you're doing multiple unit projects? Well, my understanding is that a developer building a multi-unit project for rent or for sale, the income that they generate from that project will be tied to the square footage. So if someone now can propose units, be they rental or condominiums, of one bedroom that are 1,400 square feet or 1,600 square feet, that project will likely result in more income or profit in the development than a project at 1,300. I think that, to me, I have to say it like it is. That's what I think it boils down to. I don't know what else it boils down to other than the per square foot sale or income from that square footage reduction is what you're really considering. And then on the positive community side, I think it's giving direction to the community that when you're doing multi-unit variable density type of projects, the city of Santa Barbara is interested in seeing reasonable sized units that will reduce the size of the project. It will have some effect along with these other things of reducing the size of the project, and you're not making any change relative to density. So that's what we would like you to consider. That is what I think the Planning Commission has been trying to do, and it would be, I think it would be very helpful to have an interim standard to back up the Planning Commission or the staff hearing officer, anyone that says to an applicant, you just need to make this unit smaller. So that's why we put it on the table for you to consider.
My largest concern is just I want to hear that by going through this would not slow down environmental review of a proposed charter change.
When we talked about that in prior meetings, we definitely have wanted to avoid a change in the allowed development density. And this does not change density. It changes the volume of space, just like, I believe, just like FARs, saying that a third story cannot be more than 60% of your building is a fairly significant design limitation of space. So I'm not sure that I could say the unit reduction size is going to reduce, create some sort of physical environmental impact. It's not clear to me that it is over that line. We will have to discuss how all of this, whatever the package of proposed ordinance changes are, we'll be writing up an assessment, and some of it will be somewhat speculative. Another component of the ordinance that will help us in that analysis ultimately will be, is there a term, a period of time for which this ordinance applies? Mr. Wiley mentioned that also. We didn't put that on your list of things to talk about today, but once we have a recommendation from the council that this is our project, we do want you to pursue an ordinance that has A, B, C, D, items, then we'll be in a much better position to tell you what the environmental review will be.
And would staff have a different reaction of what the max use unit sizes would be if you allowed a market, I guess, a market provision in this? In my mind, big unit sizes creates bulkiness, which impedes on sort of the open feel of neighborhoods near the downtown. If we follow that logic, if you buy into that logic, then at some level, purchasing power for open space is a mitigation for that kind of bulkiness created by larger units. So instead of having one size fits all sort of max unit size, the other idea that I've continuously hammered, which is just that you should have a benchmark unit size that we consider reasonable, and that any square footage over that, and I'm not the only one that's come up with this idea. You came up with it before I did, which is that that any square footage above that goes into incurs a mitigation fee for purchase of open space or other improvements downtown to mitigate the impact of the larger units.
Yes, and along those lines or relate to different density standards and how to incentivize the housing you want and have the housing that, like market housing, that has these impacts. Again, that's within the package of Plan Santa Barbara policies. If you wanted to consider that now, I think that that would be difficult in that we don't really have the mechanisms to, that complicates the ordinance. What are we going to do with, we haven't decided if there are fees or what the fees would be targeted to. That's definitely inviting a little bit of complexity to this, but I welcome that complexity next time you talk about Plan Santa Barbara, please. Then I think it really fits. Here, Mr.
You'd
Wiley's
recommend
not
this
sitting at
as
the
a
table, but
placeholder.
here, that would complicate it. I don't know if it would be an environmental review issue, but it certainly would be an implementation issue as to what mitigation fee. We don't have a mitigation fee study yet, although we've done the preliminary work for that.
Yeah, I was hoping that would be done because I know you guys have been looking at this
I think we
subject
need
for-
something like that in place to implement some of the policy direction and goals that the community has for increasing open space. So we heard that throughout the community. And so I think it would behoove the city to go in that direction for some of the broader goals that we've talked about.
Questions, Mr. Francisco? Oh, your light's on. Oh.
Betty, just because we're sort of continuing the conversation from last time, and you brought up the unit size thing like this, I really appreciate the discussion. And maybe just to reveal where I'm coming from on this, I can hardly wait to get into some of the complexities and the goodness and rich conversation that's going to come out of Plan Santa Barbara when we start to look at how these policies that are going to be generated start to get implemented, and we work on these things. And I can see that it is going to be complex, but our staff is fully competent and capable to deal with that on an ongoing daily, weekly basis. And so are our design review boards, and they have all that discretion that they can use these tools. But I guess what I've been struggling with, the tug of war I'm in, is how to come up with something that is extremely simple to as an enriched alternative, if you will, to what is on the ballot, and also something that can be implemented in a relatively short period of time, so that the design review process informs anybody who's coming through what the parameters are until we get the general plan on the ground. And so the more complex this is, the more it moves away from what I think is needed right now, and the simpler and more elegant it is. So I'm preparing myself to think that we might come up with something that deals more strictly with heights and whatever variations might, how the definition and how, and maybe if there's any allowances for community priority or for affordability or something. But that's sort of where I feel that we need to almost discipline ourselves to get down to very, very simple, elegant terms now. And then really, this is great to begin to talk about these other possibilities, but it's almost like a preview of what we're going to be able to get into once the Plan Santa Barbara is complete. So I just share that with you guys too, because I think it's important that we all know where we're coming from in this. Anyway, thank you.
Well, I'd like to take public comment now. I would ask for at least for my purposes and making decision that going subject by subject through your comments would be very useful, and any advice that you would have for us in terms of figures, even if the figures are 0 or 100%, it would be valuable to me instead of just saying you like it or you don't. I would like to know what elements you like of it and what elements you don't, because it's probably a big enough package that that just about everyone will like some things and just about everyone will dislike some things in the package. And I feel very strongly that there's an interplay between these, because it seems to me from my analysis of it that the April 8th interim ordinance has stronger setback requirements than current code, but that staff are proposing something that has even stronger setback requirements. At the same time, the maximum FARs proposed in the April 8th ordinance are obviously stronger than existing code, and I would say are also stronger than what staff is proposing. So staff, to me, is proposing something that's stronger on setback requirements but weaker on FAR requirements than the April 8th ordinance. And I guess my point of pointing that out is that if we put too much burdens, we're not going to have anything built. So there's a little bit of an interplay between height, what setbacks we require, and what and what FARs we do. And there's a balance. And in my mind, if we require lower heights, then we need to be more generous on the other things. On the other hand, if we allow some heights, we can be more restrictive on the other two. And similarly, the interplay between setbacks and FARs. So with that request for detail from you, I'll start with Diane Channing and move on to Alex Peugeot.
Hello, I'm Diane Channing, and I worked extensively on the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance revision, and I want to thank the city for recognizing that we had a problem, devoting the resources to that, and getting that job done. I can't thank you enough. And thank you for recognizing that we have a problem downtown and that we need to address it now. As far as everything that was said last week, I generally agree with most everything, particularly the unit size problem. I like the chart that was put up there, and I like the recommendations for mitigation. I hope we can get there. I think that's a good idea. Now, there's just a few points I want to make. Wedding caking has been described as a solution to the problem of bulk and scale, and it's a solution, but I don't think it's the best one, in my opinion. I would like to see guidelines that do not incentivize the George Washington Smith model and gracious ground floor space, particularly paseos. I mean, I think those kind of buildings would just be a huge asset to our downtown. So I would ask that we don't limit the regulations so that people are forced into this wedding cake look. The other thing is the public confidence in any interim ordinance or ballot measure that the city puts forward, I think needs to have a council supermajority to pass. And I think having that threshold so that if you're going over your height limit with a community benefit, and I'm looking forward to the discussion on what those community benefits might be. But anyway, I think a supermajority would really help the public confidence on that level. Thank you.
Alex Peugeot, followed by Bruce Bartlett.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm a little confused. I was under the impression that the idea was to do a simple and swift interim ordinance to move it through, and on the same side, parallel to the plan Santa Barbara. And it appears to me that this is pretty comprehensive, and it's really, and I don't really disagree in general terms with what's being presented, but it does take away from the public discussion some of these elements. Especially about the term the unit size. Unit size makes sense in terms of variable density discussion, because I disagree with Ms. Weiss that the goal of this is reducing the mass of buildings. Yes, that's a goal, but it's also changing the purpose of the building. I think with Chapala 1, some of the criticism is not that it's big, but it's big for whom? And if instead of having those big units in the top, those were split in half, then yeah, now you're talking about building size, unit size, but there's a variable density. The variable density is complex. Then it gets into parking, it gets into a whole bunch of other things. And I'm really very eager to get into that discussion, but that's not something you can just jump on and just bring it in at the last minute. Otherwise, all it is just, well, you're putting less housing on these buildings and making them smaller, but it doesn't quite complete the discussion. And I agree with the comment on the wedding cake. I think, let me backtrack a little bit. If you think in terms of swift and simple to get it going real soon, and then we work out the details with the plan Santa Barbara, there is a lot going on in here. It's just, I couple my finger, but it seems like it's growing a little bit more than, perhaps it's the way the chart is shown. I'm not totally understand exactly. There was no staff report, so I didn't have a chance to study this exactly. It does seem like a lot in terms of details and so forth to go into the concept is to have an ordinance that addresses heights, and it has, I believe, if you continue that, has 3 exclusions, right? 1, projects that have been deemed complete by the city prior to a certain date. That would be 1 exception. The second one would be community priority projects, and those are usually commercial things that are established by measured E, I believe. And that would be, for instance, College Hospital or the Marburg facility or some big thing, but usually it's related to commercial activities. The third one is the one about housing projects where at least 30% of the residential units are affordable to those earning 200%. And I will submit, it's something that we seem to all have forgotten, but we should add rental projects. I'm not sure between now and the end of Plan Santa Barbara, the economy being what it is, we'll have anything like this in the horizon. But I think it makes sense just to guide the discussion to include rental projects. I can think of the MTD project on the that had rentals. And, you know, I think it's perfectly appropriate to add that to the exclusion, to the third exclusion on housing. So anyway, I would my comment is to direct this for a swift and simple ordinance with these exceptions, and try to stay away from these potential things that can drag on forever. Thank you.
Mr. Peugeot, can I ask you a question? And it seems like a joke, but so if generally with architects, if we call them FARs, you don't like them, but if we call them form-based codes, you do like them, even if they amount to the same things.
Well, they are kind of the same. Right? The reason, I mean, the conversation about form-based code is complex and should be in a separate place. The problem, as we talked previously, is that many people are distrustful of the process. They imagine, okay, that's the mass Vulcan scale of what's going to be built, and people think, okay, yeah, next year it will be built like that. And they think that the tradition of Santa Barbara, which is slow growth because everything moves so slowly, then that will be, undercut by the creation of a objective that everybody agrees upon. So that's where the rubber hits the road. That was the problem with that. But FARs is fine, but it just gets to be, if you have adding all these things, FARs, setbacks, on the ground, and this and that and the other thing, okay, that's fine, but we need to spend a lot of time discussing that. It cannot something that can be done in this committee and then done right away. Just trying to simply streamline and make it a little bit simpler. So remember, it's an interim ordinance. We can get into the general plan with a little bit more into it. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee. Bruce Bartlett. I'm not wearing my Planning Commission hat today, so I just wanted to respond to the staff report, and I'll try and go through it in order, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of back and forth once everybody gets done. But I think it's a good start, but I think, as Alex said, it's starting to take on too much for the intent of where we're at, and I think we need to try and keep it simple, and I think we also need to realize that there's not this rush to the gate of projects coming in. I'd be surprised if there's any applications. I spoke with Jaime Limon before the meeting, and he's not seen many that would even fall into the category that we're looking at in the last few months. So it's not like the well's going to run dry before we can get done with Plan Santa Barbara. What we really need to do is try and incentivize at least the right kind of projects if we expect to have any going on. So with that being said, on the open space requirements, I understand the 5-foot average setback on commercial buildings, but when it's 100% commercial, I'm not sure the intent on that. Everything that we have downtown is built to the sidewalk, and it really breaks from the form that we have. I understand it totally on mixed use, where you've got other uses in that. So I would question it on the 100% commercial building. I do like on the mixed-use buildings of having flexibility on where we do our 15% open space. I think it's appropriate to have the open space adjacent to the uses that really need it, and in most cases that's for the residential component, because commercial traditionally has not had open space requirements. In terms of the setbacks, I think what has happened between the April 08 interim ordinance that was discussed, it was not divided into C2 and CM zones. It was divided into commercial uses and residential type uses. And it's more appropriate to have the exemption to the 5-foot average setback run to match what's already built and all on the ground. In other words, from Cabrillo to Sola, you think of the block where the Arlington Theater is, all those buildings are built to the sidewalk. Why would we stop at Victoria and now require setbacks? So I think we need to follow the built example that we have on the ground and keep it as Cabrillo to Sola Street for the exemption on the street sidewalk. I think that's important to kind of keep the context of what's historically built to date and not change it after the fact. If one of those buildings torn down, now you're going to have a building set back with all the rest at the sidewalk. I know it doesn't fit between the C2 and the CM zone designation, but maybe it's the land use zone designation that seems to be dictating over the built pattern that we've become accustomed to and that's historic. On the maximum floor areas, I think that these are in the reasonable range. I think because the fourth floor one as proposed has been reduced, then I would probably go to the 70% range for the third floor so that it averages out about the same. I think in the prior examples, the reason it was less on the first and second floors, the 80%, was we were talking about mixed-use projects or residential projects have setback requirements, so you can't build 100%. You couldn't do a residential at 100%, so why have a FAR of 100%? But that's why that one was the way it was. In terms of the height, obviously what is being proposed, there are two choices. I would prefer the first choice, given that there's hardly any projects coming forward. I'd be surprised if we get more than one or two that even fall into this category during this interim period. But if you do go with the second choice, which needs the community priority designation, I think as Alex mentioned, we really need to include rentals in here. People are not buying houses now, they're losing houses. And rentals are far more affordable even than our affordable for sale stock. So I think that's one category that really wants to be put into that. And on the unit size discussion, I would prefer to not have that part of the interim ordinance. It's way too complex. If it is going to be there, it should be a change to the variable density and not just a maximum to unit size. If you're going to cut out 30% of your volume of residential that you can build by limiting unit size, you need, that's what would have been our desire on affordability, and you're cutting that much off the top and then restricting unit size. You can't make up for it with more smaller units to even be the equivalent of what we had before. So it's really producing far less housing. I agree that it wants to be small, but it needs to be done as variable density and not just a limitation on unit size. Again, I think we need a clear definition as to the pipeline. When does this start? What projects are under the old rules? What would be under the new? Because I think there would be a lot of confusion there. And then I think we need to have a clear end date. Would this end when we adopt whatever comes out of Plan Santa Barbara? So I think we just need to be clear on those as well. So thanks.
We have Sheila Lodge, followed by Priscilla Badala.
Hello, I'm Sheila Lodge. Good afternoon, members of the Ordinance Committee. I'd like to try to clarify where some of these things came from. I was part of the group that put together the April draft interim ordinance, as was Councilmember Williams, and then there were three architects, Bill Mahan, Deddy Pikert, and Baron Kernal. And on the setbacks, I would like to see an additional 10% in that lot area where it's a mixed-use building. One of my big concerns was just general livability for people who end up being in these projects. Mr. Pikert was the architect for Casa de las Fuentes, which has a large central courtyard where there is the possibility to have lawn. Now, of course, it's not a mixed-use project, but which makes it a big difference. It's entirely residential. But there is space within the project so that people can see out of their units, and then there's also a large open deck over the parking for the project, along with some of the units, with a lot of space and a sense where people can actually see out, they can see the mountains. To me, this is a far more desirable kind of project to be building, whether it's affordable or market rate, for the people who are going to be living in these projects. So I personally would like to see as much open space, and open space where there is bare dirt, so you can plant a tree. Because on the second floor, or if it's on a podium, lot line to lot line building on the ground floor, commercial, you can't. And if it's over an underground parking structure, the setbacks. I'm a little surprised to see the exception of State Street frontage. That is in the interim, the April draft. That's, I believe, where it came from. And the reason for that was that it was considered that the properties on State Street have already given up, with the widened sidewalks, part of the space that they might have been able to build on otherwise. Actually, it was taken for, the sidewalks were extended into the street, but still there is more of a setback already there. And there was some concern for the fact that they've already kind of paid into this, either financially or with buildable space. So I don't have a problem with continuing that in the proposed interim ordinance. Maximum floor areas, I disagree on wedding caking. I noticed that the big projects do a certain amount of that, like Paseo Chapala, for example, is set back in the back, the fourth story element, by quite a bit. And that project is the one, by the way, where the 52 feet came from. That project to the ridge line is 52 feet. And that actually should be a lower number if you're going to use the method of measuring that is in the April proposal, because that was, as was mentioned, the idea, as you mentioned, Mr. Williams, the idea behind measuring the 40 feet to the plate height, top of the plate height, is to allow for sloping roofs. I was concerned that you get nothing but flat roof buildings. Going back for a moment to the open space around residential buildings, I think at least what I had in mind was a project like Radio Square, where there are separate buildings that are part of the project. It's all a mixed use, commercial and residential, but 3 of the buildings, as I recall, were entirely residential. It doesn't make much sense to have dwelling units right up against a building. I mean, you've got to have some place for light and air, and this was one of our concerns in the April ordinance, and in making sure that there was plenty of that. As we said, this was not discussed in the unit size was not discussed in the April ordinance. And I can understand the interest. I understand the point that Mr. Bartlett made also. If you do not go for a lowered height limit, which I, of course, strongly urge you to do, what about reducing ceiling heights? That would reduce the bulk of the project, and you would get more sustainable units, ones that would require less energy use to heat and cool, and less in construction materials. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Priscilla Badala, followed by Jim Caldwell.
Thank you. Priscilla Badola from the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors.
Sorry for mispronouncing that.
First of all, we'd like to say that as regards to Mr. Bartlett's comments, we agree with those. And it just seems to complicate the issues by having an interim ordinance. And why not just go forward trying to work out the general plan and not have an interim ordinance? Once the interim ordinance is in place, then the general plan would drag on longer and longer and never come to fruition. We appreciated Grant House's comments about photos of actual buildings. That would be extremely helpful if we could see different buildings and what the height limitations were on those buildings, the setbacks, et cetera, so we could really judge from a photo and not just from graphs. And the other issue is that shouldn't the ABR be looking at these buildings that are under construction? And wasn't there a new zoning ordinance recently adopted that dealt with many of these issues? Why do we need another interim ordinance if some of these issues have already been addressed? Thank you.
Mr. Caldwell.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Jim Caldwell, representing the Santa Barbara Board of Realtors. As we stated in last week's meeting, the Santa Barbara Board of Realtors is against the interim ordinance. We feel these issues should be discussed, but we feel they should be in the interim plan. Personally, I feel there's an awful lot of duplication of efforts here where we're moving toward a general plan and we keep visiting many of these issues over and over again. It seems, at least in my overview, that we're trying to micromanage this thing. We're so fearful of anything slipping through in the process now until we get a general plan that we're really going to stymie anything going through, period. And as been noted, there's virtually nothing on the docket now. And I think that's as a result of fear on the part of a lot of people that we are over-managing this thing. I think the issues are definitely important, be it setbacks, open space, height restrictions. But again, height. We've already got that coming up on an initiative on a ballot in a year. Now, why are we sitting here putting a lot of effort into trying to say something when we already have the process in place? So I would really seriously consider that you should look at the fact that possibly an interim ordinance is just an absolute waste of time and effort at this point in time. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Caldwell, I just want to ask a clarification of the Board of Realtors position, because it's my understanding that the Board of Realtors has taken a position against the building heights initiative that's been just qualified for the ballot at 40 feet.
Correct.
And if you're again against a substitute charter amendment, which is what we are discussing, we arrived at last week that we were going to attempt to carve out a substitute charter amendment, which is why we'd be moving. If you're against that too, does that mean you're just arguing for no change to the building height setback?
Unfortunately, Doss, I wasn't able to be here last week. I was out of town, so I didn't hear some of the conversations last week. There is negative against both issues there. I think the case is, I see something that keeps coming up is simplicity, and I don't see anything presented here today to be simple. To me, it seems like we're rushing a bunch of stuff through to stop anything happening, calling it an interim ordinance, and we're going to grind the wheels to a total stop. And be it whether you're in favor or against height restriction or anything else, I think we've got too many people so afraid that something is going to slip through the cracks in the next year or year and a half until we get Plan of Santa Barbara. Yet we spent an immense amount of time trying to put this together and put something in place that's going to carry us for many, many years past most of our lives, or at least our ability to manage these things. And to me, it's completely compromising what we're trying to do in the long run with Plan Santa Barbara to push an interim ordinance through right now, just to say we have something that's a stopgap. So I think that's where I'm really coming from.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comments from council members? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the comments of many people, Mr. Peugeot, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. House. We are taking on, I think, far too much here. I think this is duplicative of the work that's being done in Plan Santa Barbara. I was not in favor of this back in April. I'm still not in favor of it now. But I think the more important point is that this barely got out of council to ordinance committee, unfortunately with very little direction. And for something to happen with this, 4 votes is not going to be enough. It's going to take 5 votes on council. And frankly, I don't see how that's going to happen. So that's another reason why I'm concerned about the amount of effort that this is going to take and the amount of staff effort that is going to be distracted from the general plan update. I also don't think, given the complexity of these issues and given the lack of direction from council when this came to ordinance committee, that's another reason for feeling that this is an inappropriate forum. I would much rather deal with this, if we're going to deal with it at all, in a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and City Council. And I believe that, as I said, that 5-vote barrier I think is insuperable. But if we were to work anything out, we would need to really go back and talk to the rest of council and the Planning Commission and say, is this really how you want us to spend our time for the next 6 months? I think this is a very complex undertaking, and as many people have said, this is exactly what we're doing in the general plan update already. I also agree with speakers who have mentioned the fact that these kinds of large projects, generally speaking, because of the economic outlook, are going to be on hold for a while. And so the urgency that understandably motivated people to try to do something about this, and which eventually led to the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative, I think that urgency is ebbing. And I think that we will have time to deal with these issues with the general plan update, and that's the right forum for it. Now, having said that, I'm here. I'm on this ordinance committee. I will continue to serve. But if we're going to spend time on this, I really think it needs to be very, very tightly constrained. And I think if I personally cannot at all get behind the idea of crafting an alternate charter amendment, I think it's been very clearly demonstrated there are at least 7,000 or 8,000 people in this town who care enough about the one that they put on the ballot to vote for it, and I think there's probably twice that many easily out there. So what I would prefer to do is, if if there are a couple of small things that we think would give comfort to people that we can deal with in a really constrained amount of time, okay. But the issues that have been laid out here are just, I think, far, far too complex. And I don't even feel comfortable spending our time on it unless we go back to council and the Planning Commission and get confirmation from them that we as an ordinance committee, who after all, I mean, our job is drafting ordinances. It's not setting policy. I want to hear from them that this is the right policy. Thank you.
Well, I believe that that's what we're doing October 8th. It's already on the schedule. So what we are tasked with is making any recommendations the committee wishes to make on what form that takes to the October 8th meeting. I agree. If you are happy with the 40-foot limit that's been placed on the ballot, and that's it, and you think that's going to solve everything, then we have nothing more to do here. We should just go home or get some lunch. The only reason why I am here is because I believe that that is an incomplete answer for the city's problems, that a charter amendment that addresses heights only and does not address setback requirements and the appropriate massing for buildings is not only incomplete but could create a lot of problems in that it provides a severe disincentive for sloped rooftops, and in that I think evident from the projects that have been approved in the last year since this issue has come up, includes much less workforce housing. And so my feeling is that a more complex answer, a more complex charter amendment that addresses the concern over heights and scale, but at the same time provides a future where we may be able to have some workforce housing, a future where we may still have a lot of good, nice red tile roofs, and a future where we do not replace tall and bulky with shorter and bulky, which is what I view as the direction that we're headed with a simple solution like a 40-foot height limit. So, hey, if we all just want the 40-foot height limit, then let's go home, because I guarantee it's going to pass next November if we don't have anything else there, because people want a solution. So I guess that would be my challenge to put out. And I thought we at least came to a consensus that we were going to attempt to create a workable interim solution to this issue, and see if we can do something better than the simple 40-foot height limit.
Okay, well, I'm sort of in a roll up my sleeves kind of mode right now. So as I look over this and start to sort of sort it out and listening to the comments that we've heard, I start with, I feel that it's that for an interim ordinance that we should be, that sort of the keystone of it is making a proposal that would be have to do with a height limit, and also identify what exceptions there might be, just in general terms, which allows for a certain kind of discretion that would require review. And of course it would if we went to that 45-foot or whatever, we come up with an actual number. I'm not sure yet that that's the number, but with a height limitation, with some allowance and some choice, which I believe, by the way, there may be many people who signed the initiative out there who, if they recognized that there were an alternative that would take into consideration whether it were the hospital or the airport terminal or the or whether it had a certain amount of affordability built into it, they might very well, want to support that as an alternative. Then again, we would only get to see that when it got to the ballot. But I think that's a keystone. I noticed that in the in this chart, which is really helpful to me, it's sort of settled down a lot of the dust around this. The other sort of key change here, which is pretty easy to explain, would have to do with in certain commercial zones, an average of 5-foot setback on commercial properties in the C2 and CM zone, with the exception perhaps on that section. I guess I do realize that it wouldn't just go to Victoria, it would go to SOLA, because that's the whole design district area that we've got. I know we've defined it a little differently before, but SOLA to the beach. But so that's really kind of elegant. The other things that are in the planned Santa Barbara interim ordinance in here really just called out what we already have in place. No change from existing interior and rear. No change for private and common open area and front yard setbacks. The ones that are existing already apply. Mixed use, just added a little bit of flexibility in the use of the 15% option, which is kind of critical when we are trying to really make it work with whatever's nearby. And I think that the flexibility the design review boards would have with how that 15% could be used. So those are some very simple things that I don't know how they get in there. I do have a concern that we start to jump the gun when we get into the FAR language at this point. If I could, again, you've all heard me, if I could roll the clock back and didn't have the urgency of a ballot initiative and something on a ballot, I would really like us to work with Plan Santa Barbara. But we've got this push right now to try to come up with something that would create an alternative, and I think we do need to create an alternative. People should have a choice and not just have only one thing that they could that they have to choose from, especially when we know enough to offer a choice. So I'm seeing here the keystone of this is the heights with some exemptions, and then the two very simple things that I think that staff has suggested here: the average 5-foot setback along the building frontage, which we know that allows for some landscaping, that could allow for some more usable space, that could allow for some tables out front of a little restaurant, like we have on State Street, and create more, interesting space. And it could be a real nice addition to make the sidewalks be wider. I mean, there's a lot of ways to make that be usable. And then the flexibility on the 15% option. And if I read this correctly, what am I missing? Let's see, we've got the unit size and we've got the FARs. And I don't believe that, I think those two things are those could take us a long time to wrestle to the ground. I may be mistaken, but I think there's a lot in that. When you start talking about unit sizes, that could be the biggest tool that we have to reduce the bulk of these buildings, and I recognize that. And but how do we get into a conversation like that without it having become another NPO deal? I mean, isn't that what happened to us the last time we decided to take on a simple little project like constraining the size of homes in our single-family neighborhoods? It just feels like that, and that's my worry. So, Mr. Chair, I mean, that's just my weather report right now and what I'm thinking about. So
my suggestion would be to try to handle this in order of simplicity, which I believe setbacks would be the simplest of the subjects. So let's start with that. Does the committee wish to make a recommendation to the October 8th meeting on setbacks?
Chair Williams, if I may, I'm sorry for the interruption. On this one point, I would really suggest that we don't go to Cabrillo Boulevard because there are significant setbacks required in the HRC2 zone that is the frontage along State Street from Cabrillo to the freeway. And so that's why we started at Montecito.
that's right. We established that entire area as the continuation
Right.
of
You don't need to put anything
very wide
different.
sidewalks
Yes.
and the whole thing.
But staff doesn't have a recommendation to SOLA?
Well, the only reason why we said Victoria is because on the east side, there's a bank with a fairly substantial setback. And actually on the west side, those little stores coming up to the Arlington aren't right to the sidewalk. But we don't feel strongly about that. No, I just wanted you to know Cabrillo is a different story. I think you would be lessening setbacks. And yes, thank you.
Mr. Chair. I have both lights on, but first we'll hear from Mr. Wiley.
I just have to say I am not clear, and I think I need to be clear going out what you want to do in the larger picture, because we keep talking about interim ordinance, but I don't really think I hear two out of the three of you talking about an interim ordinance. But let me ask that question. Let me figure this out. There's several ways this committee several things this committee could recommend to the City Council. A interim or temporary zoning ordinance adopted by the City Council as soon as possible, as soon as we get through environmental review. It would just be an ordinance. It would be adopted by the City Council. It wouldn't counteract or it couldn't conflict with any existing or future charter amendment. So the Save El Pueblo Viejo charter amendment would trump it, basically, if this interim ordinance dealt with height. But that's one option. A council adopted zoning ordinance would require 5 votes, obviously, as a zoning ordinance. You could do a charter amendment and have it on the ballot. You know, presumably at this point it looks like the Save El Pueblo Viejo initiative will be on the ballot at some point in 2009, probably November. I think the plan is November of 2009. You could do an alternative charter amendment dealing with the height. And I think I mentioned this last week. What I'm hearing is a concern somewhere between 40 feet and 60 feet, that there be some flexibility for projects which propose affordable units, for projects which are community priority. Those are the two main ones I think I've heard. To really have that as a true alternative, I think it needs to be a charter amendment. So I think we should think in those terms. And one of the reasons I mention that is I think just about everyone in this room would agree, and historically this has always been the way it's done, when you get into detail, you don't really put that in the charter. That's considered bad ballot box planning. And that's why, whether it's Measure E or the original charter height limitation in 1972, they always say, well, and the detail will be in an ordinance adopted by the City Council, whether it's how you measure height or how you define economic development. So if you were to propose a charter amendment, you might want to propose any detail, any explanation, definitions as an amendment, as an ordinance adopted by the city council. And that's another question then. You could actually put an ordinance on the ballot as well. And you could put it on in conjunction with a charter amendment, or you could put it on separately. Now, an ordinance that's approved by the voters can't be changed by the city council. An ordinance can only be changed by the voters. But, of course, it doesn't trump a charter amendment. So there's actually several options here. You can even put an ordinance on the ballot, and the ordinance can say that it can be amended by the city council, and the voters approve that, then it can be amended by the city council.
Mr. Weil, let me ask you a question. If we at Ordinance Committee took up these issues that are on this grid here and the public comment and put together an authentic interim ordinance that began to move into some of this territory. Of course, that could be changed on any given Tuesday, I guess, if after another similar process. Yeah. 2 Tuesdays, thank you. And you would, but this could be a useful tool for our design review boards and for staff and for the applicants coming through the process. If the city council as a whole decided to extract from this something very simple, from, say, just the height part with some alternatives, as we've been discussing, and with, I guess it requires a 5-person vote to put it on a ballot, or is it?
No, I don't read the charter as requiring a 5-person vote to put anything on the ballot.
Okay, so if the council decided to put something out of that ordinance, extract something and take that piece and ask for that to be put on a ballot in November 2009. That could be done in this ordinance. Whatever we worked on here could continue on as an interim ordinance until whenever we said the term was up, right?
That's correct. We've got to do environmental review, and we're trying to keep it simple.
But the environmental review would be on the part that the council would decide to put on the ballot, right?
That would be the critical.
So this is an answer a little bit, I think, perhaps, Mr. Chair. This may be an answer to a concern I hear you have. I share it to some degree. The work that we're doing now could help illuminate issues around each of these different things and help us come up with an ordinance that might be a little bit more rich. Council, if the council desires to do it, would take something maybe out of this, something very elegant and simple, and say, this is a question that we believe should be on the ballot for the voters to consider. And it would be simple enough that environmental review would be expeditious and would be able to be handled in the time. That would free me up a little bit to be able to sort of keep my rolled up sleeves working with Betty on things like unit sizes, and we could talk a little bit more about that as part of an interim ordinance.
Chair Williams, I did just finish drafting a brief report for your joint meeting next Wednesday. And what I think would be most helpful for preparing for next Wednesday is the questions that Mr. Wiley just posed. That at the joint meeting, the discussion be, yes, we are interested in having you work on an ordinance and a charter amendment, or let's just focus on the charter amendment and hold off on the time and the detail of the ordinance. Or no, it's important that we show responsiveness and move forward with an ordinance and a charter amendment. Or people who may feel that the charter amendment should not be proposed by the council at all because of the initiative process. And so rather than talk about that the ordinance committee has decided on a 3-0 or a 2-1 vote that we have a new 5-foot setback. I think what this discussion and the public dialogue that has come and participated has crystallized that really we're looking for council direction, and that after the ordinance, the joint meeting, staff will schedule an item for the full council to provide direction to pursue an ordinance and a charter amendment or something else. And your committee member House, I think his approach of let's look at it holistically and see how it works as a package and what part of the package would make as an ordinance, I think is a very good way, and that's consistent with what you've desired as a more complete package. But it really will be helpful to know what the discussion you have next week, and then hopefully a week or two later we would just get back on the full council for the the vote. But these two meetings have been very informative. We hadn't had this much dialogue back in April, and so I think that this is achieved at the ordinance committee level, what we intended to do. And I think perhaps if you want to further, the details of setback or no FAR, that would be great. But I am going to pose the question.
The main question you wished us to answer is a recommendation on whether we should pursue a charter amendment, an ordinance, or both.
And just really preparing for next meeting, if you want to take a vote on it or just discuss it today, I don't think it necessarily requires a vote, but that's up to you.
Well, absolutely. I'm going to let Mr. Francisco speak, but on the question of an ordinance, I thought we had answered this last week, but on the question of an ordinance, a charter amendment, or both, or neither, Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Ms. Weiss's suggestion, but I do want to say one thing about this whole question of ordinance and charter amendment. As I understand it, what you're proposing is a building height measure that would allow exceptions for community priority, which were hospitals and spacecraft assembly stations and that sort of thing, which don't come up that often, MRFs, yes. And for buildings that have some percentage of affordable housing. And all I would say about that is the two buildings that caused the biggest uproar in the first place and that inspired the petition drive have plenty of affordable housing. So I don't really think that is going to sway people. The thing that alarmed people about those buildings was not just the height, but the fact, Paseo Chapala, for instance, no setbacks, and lack of open space. And it's not a problem for commercial buildings. It's a problem when residential and commercial is combined. And so if you want to, what I hear you saying is you want to head off the 40-foot height initiative.
You want me to answer the question?
Well, just let me finish this, because, whether you think that or not, in a way, it almost doesn't matter. The only thing that would head that off, I mean, what you or I personally think about it, really isn't all that important in terms of a voter initiative. That's all I'm saying. The only thing that would head that off is something that would show people that future mixed-use buildings would not have the aesthetic problems that have been perceived with existing ones. And I really think all that comes down to is setbacks and open space. And that is something that is simple enough that it could actually be dealt with expeditiously.
I would agree with that. I would only remark that without handling heights, I don't think anybody will really view this as a better measure, a superior measure to that which is already qualified on the ballot, to be on the ballot. And I would just argue that that yes, the affordability requirement would have been met or nearly met by those two projects, but the setback, open space, and arguably the FAR requirements would not have. So
not by both of them.
Cases, not by both of them. Mr. House?
Okay, we probably should start winding this down. I should have to remind somebody that the setback to the creek on the one project made it go up to 4 stories. It could have been a 3-story building, and there could have been substantially more interior for the use of the residents' open space on that project the way it was originally designed, or could have been designed before we asked it to have all that setback. And it's very interesting how these things move around. One of the good things is that we've all been learning from these experiences, and we've been strengthening our design review board's ability to expressed their concerns about these so that we'll be able to nip stuff like that in the bud and maybe look out for some of the unintended consequences on the way. I just don't want to say to staff, I don't want to lose the benefit of the input that we received today from the public. There was some, for instance, the concept that the rentals might be one of the additional enrichments to a height issue, and then somebody else helped us begin to narrow down if we did do the FARs that perhaps going more to the 70% on the third story. And so there's been some suggestions and a little bit of helpful input. Even go back the general concept that if this were to move forward towards a ballot, the simplicity of it is critical. The concerns that I don't know who can help us with, but we should really have some assistance when we get into it about how this issue of wedding caking, whether you hardwire that in or whether you, because we do have a tradition in the George Washington Smith Luda May Riggs style, which is really very vertical and very, boxy, just, very simple. We don't want to do harm. So those are that, when we really get into it, we need to be able to have a chance to discuss it at that level. I believe that we've got enough here. I think staff can help formulate this for the City Council Planning Commission. And those choices that we were just outlining, I would really like to have direction at the Ordinance Committee level as to what we're really working on. Should we be simultaneously working on an interim ordinance and trying to refine down to a specific thing that would come back to council for a ballot, or is that not necessary, or what? I think we should hear from the larger group before we do any more work on this here.
Well, I fail to see what work we've done. We haven't yet made a recommendation on anything in 2 weeks. So if this committee would like to make a recommendation, we have at least another 5 or 10 minutes to do that. If we don't, then I can guarantee you the October 8th hearing will be even more chaotic, even more directionless, and even less conclusive than anything that we have done here, because that's just by virtue of how many people are in the room speaking. I personally, I would like to see a recommendation on at least the very basic question that staff has asked us, whether we are pursuing a charter amendment, an interim ordinance, or both. And without even addressing that, I don't think we've done our job.
Well, Mr. Chair, what I suggested as a possibility, if we didn't even have the meeting on the 8th and we wanted to work on this from an ordinance perspective, there's nothing in that work that would prohibit the City Council as a whole from picking one element or another out of it and putting that on a ballot. So, I mean, we've got some really interesting things here. I mean, I just don't think we're in a position now to start knocking them down and saying,
That's not what I asked.
Okay.
I asked the basic question of, are we recommending that council pursue a charter amendment, an interim ordinance, or both, or neither? And if we can't answer that today, then how are we going to expect 14 of us to have a coherent answer for that next week? I'm here to do a charter amendment. And if no one else, if you aren't, then I'm ready to end this.
Okay. So very interesting discussion. I'm here to work on, I came into this discussion to come up with something that would be useful for our boards and commissions between now and when Plan Santa Barbara begins to give us the direction we need to really craft the implementing ordinances. And also to refine in that conversation, to simplify, refine the nut of the issue that could be useful to City Council in putting something on a ballot in 2009. I had a dual goal here. I expressed at the beginning of the meeting exactly where I was standing. I thought we should simplify this particular conversation down to its absolute essence, which had to do with height, and whether there's some things that could mitigate the issue of height that would be of value to the community. And I still stand in that place. I believe that I don't want to duck all this other great stuff because it's really going to be very helpful if Councilmember Francisco's suggestion is that there's another key element to this that would resonate, would actually address the concerns that we've been hearing from the public, that would be appropriate to include in some alternative. If the council were to wish to do that, I'd be open to that. I just can't quite figure out how to do it without having become a monster project. That's my worry. So for simplicity, I would like us to move forward on this, on the height with some alternatives issue, as a possible future item for the ballot. But I believe City Council hasn't told us to do that. I mean, that wasn't in the motion as such, was it? No, it was called an interim ordinance. And so, I mean, I can make some kind of a motion here, but I think we've got enough for council to give us back very specific direction.
Well, that's what I'm asking for, is a motion, because we have a question. We actually, this committee can.
Okay, I got it. I move that we move forward with the ordinance committee continue to work on an interim ordinance, taking into consideration the variety of material that we've gotten from staff so far, and identifying from these things items that are implementable in the short term and until the Plan Santa Barbara process is complete. And at the same time, this is part of my motion, at the same time that we attempt to refine some key elements that could be useful for a future ballot measure charter amendment. Do we do both at the same time?
So we have a motion and a second, and I just have a question. So just so I'm trying to keep this simple so everybody understands what's going on. So the idea is that we are going to take this package of items for an interim ordinance and narrow down that package for a possible charter amendment. Is that?
Yes, that we're going to work on an ordinance and in the process identify the essential key components that would be proposed to the City Council for a possible interim.
Okay. I've got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So that's unanimous. Does the committee have any comments of what should be included in that eventual form? Because
I've commented very clearly that I believe that the building height and 2 or possibly 3, I can see possibility of 3 things that might be included along with that. A maximum building height, which I think we have to have some discussion on, and maybe some images and stuff to work with. And I see community priority, which is a deliberative process, a double inclusionary requirement, and possibly something to do with rentals. And so those are the 3 things that would scope that out, that conversation. Now, I'm definitely open to something else that would really make that sing with addressing the issue or concern that we've been hearing from the public that would add value to that. But at the very minimum, that's what I believe that we should be discussing next time we meet.
what about this inclusion of the setbacks?
Well, we hear you guys talk about it, because for me, that's my essential keystone of the conversation, quite honestly. Okay. And again, open to enrichment, because I think, Mr. Francisco, you're correct. There's probably some other way to articulate that concern into something that would be practical, that could be useful, that might make something of real value if it were to be put on a ballot. But I want to hear that discussion hear what you guys have to say about it.
Well, I would include in that the short list for a charter amendment to me would be incomplete without a setback requirement. I think, to Mr. Francisco's point, there are more than one reason why those buildings were considered a little bit much by some folks, and one of the biggest reasons is the setback, and the front yard setback. And to me, that a 5-foot variable setback would be a flexible but also a great improvement on that, because it would allow there to be some changes of massing and would avoid just the feeling of bulk. If you look at some of the buildings that have been designed since the 40-foot height initiative has been put forward, they are still bulky and still right to setback lines, and they still look really big. So I would say that a 5-foot variable setback should be at minimum included. I am willing and ready to go into max FARs or form-based codes, if whatever you want to call them. It's essentially the same thing, but if no other committee members wish to, I don't need to have that included.
And I feel pretty much as I've already said, of course, building height itself is an issue, and setbacks and open space, I think, would be determinative. That's what most people care about, and I agree all these other issues that have been brought up, from unit size, everything else, are all interesting, but extremely complex. And if the goal of this committee, as I understood it, the goal of the committee was to do an interim ordinance. Now, if City Council chooses to take that work and take part or all or none of it and turn it into a charter amendment, fine. But I think the only hope of accomplishing anything in reasonable time that would give people reassurance that we're on the right path is focusing on those three things: height, setback, open space.
I'd like
That's
to
just
ask a
how I
question,
see it.
Mr. Chair, of Mr. Francisco, if I may, about that. The idea of open space for me is interesting because it has different meanings. You know, we all know that. So let's say there were common open space that were in the interior of a courtyard home. That could be very valuable, and it would be a wonderful style, and it's been used all over the place. From the exterior, however, it forms a blank wall to the public on four sides.
Right.
So are we talking about, when we say the word open space, I'm a little concerned about the value to the people who live there. I see great benefit in an urban setting. This is different from suburban setting, where open space means a yard, swing set and stuff. But in a downtown type environment, it almost seems like the actual shape of the exterior of the building, or more than that, the bulk of it, which goes to what our staff has been recommending with the unit size issue. That has more to do with what people are concerned about than maybe an interior usable.
No question.
Playground.
And just to be clear about that, I mean, I think when we were deliberating on 1298 Coast Village Road, that was a good example of that, because the common open space on the second floor dictated the outer envelope of the building that some people found too much. So when I'm talking about open space, I'm not just talking about common open space. I'm also talking about private open space. So, you know, both of those things.
Okay, so each unit's got a private space that's required of it, a certain amount. That's already in the thing. And in all the zones except for CM and C2, we have setback requirements, which go to the exterior type open space, the relief to the sides and the front and all. And so when we're talking about in the areas of the most intense development downtown, which would be C2 and C and CM just outside of it, and over that way, we have there the issue then maybe is more in terms of the bulk in its appearance or something as it moves. Yeah. So I would like I don't think we can do that today. We're running out of time.
Right.
But I think it would be really nice to have some help from staff as to how we wrestle with what, from a public perception image of what a big building is, how we address the concerns we've been hearing from the public. What are the tools? And I think you've given us some here, but how do we get there in a constrained amount of time to get something on the ground that could be useful to us?
Let me make a suggestion. One is I would want to make it clear to staff for their staff report that I am in agreement with Mr. Francisco that the three essential elements of the charter amendment is building height, setbacks, and open space. I think setbacks are pretty easy. I think open space is more complicated, and I would make a request that we look at what the interplay more along the lines that you've done in these slides, but maybe on the 8th look at it a little bit more detailed. What kind of open space by nature of the 5-foot variable setback is created, and how difficult it would be to create additional open space requirements on that. I think that would be useful. But as those being the three essential elements, I am in agreement with Mr. Francisco. I'm also in agreement with Mr. House that there should be two height limits. One height for most projects, another height for projects that meet some great community benefit, i.e. community priority projects, twice inclusionary, and or rentals with some sort of maybe some criteria. But I am, so that a majority of the committee is in agreement on those 2 points.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how much open space and setback discussion we're going to be ready for or be able to handle with the 14 people.
Right.
But presumably we'll have a good discussion. I expect we will on Wednesday. Return to council for direction. We're back here. Our game plan entailed some visuals and a broader workshop discussion. I think that really, presuming that we're moving forward with this process, interim ordinance components of it, which could be a charter or all, we will then prepare more visual information for you and do some outreach to coordinate and elevate the community input around the visual understanding, the bulkiness and all those things. I think for next week we'll be able to, all of us here, be able to talk about how you've wrapped this up in the 2 meetings, what you've come to conclude is important and simple and so forth.
Mr. Chair, I tend to think that for the meeting that's coming up, the one on the 8th, is it?
Yes, next Wednesday.
That's more that's not into these details. This conversation, this is nice. This is the beginning of a conversation that could be very productive that is at ordinance. And I'm really looking forward to some of the imagery and some of the, I mean, it really goes, I mean, it's scary for some people when we use the word form-based. That sort of now has some negative connotation somewhere. But the conversation could be pretty interesting if we were to look at it through that lens, because it's what we're talking about. It's this interplay.
Yes,
between
three-dimensional.
open space, it's a three-dimensional thing.
Yes.
And so I think we could do some work here. It'd be good.
I think we will work with the city attorney, and I think next week I'd like to have more discussion around the building height and these issues as you've defined it, the 2 levels and what's the difference. And I think that kind of policy direction could be very helpful to have, and we could more easily prepare for that by next Wednesday versus the visuals. The visuals will come back to you all, if that makes sense, I think. Okay, thank you.
Well, we're ready to adjourn, and I just want to say, for the sake of folks who have just come in, that council may start a little late since we haven't said a happy birthday to one of our staff assistants yet. So that's important. So just maybe give us a couple minutes to come back.